Rabies and Germs, welcome to NJ Today. My name's McConaughey, and you're either watching this on my official YouTube channel or on mishmashers.com. Thanks for watching, and for today's video, I'll be sharing my thoughts on the adventure puzzle game, RiME. Developed by Tequila Works, the early concept work originally carried the working title of Echoes of Siren. This was back when it was greenlit by Microsoft, who eventually noped out of the deal, leaving Sony to pick up the scraps for a PlayStation 4 release. Since then, Tequila Works has gotten the rights back, which allowed it to be released on the Nintendo Switch about a half year after its initial launch. The reason I'm talking about it today is because PlayStation Plus's free games for the month of February included RiME. I'll be honest, I wasn't very excited when RiME was announced as one of the PlayStation Plus's free games. Simply put, because when it comes to indie video games, although there is certainly some worthwhile additions, it's been my experience that they are more miss than they are win. I hadn't heard of RiME, but I figured I might as well give it an honest chance. The video game follows a small boy who arrives at this strange and mysterious island, all alone after watching his father go overboard from their boat during a storm. The storyline is minimalist, not featuring a lot of dialogue aside from occasional yells from the young protagonist, and deals the player with solving environmental puzzles across 5 levels loosely based on the 5 stages of grief. Something I was taken by from the get-go was the visuals from the game. The aesthetic is appeasing certainly, recalling a uniqueness, freshness, and embrace that we rarely see. I thought that to myself for a couple of seconds, then I realized that it isn't necessarily as unique as I originally perceived. Ultimately, the visuals of RiME are familiar. Like many different video games, the most glaring to me was Ico. And while I would still go out of my way to praise the visuals, the familiarity is distinctive. Because if I were to close my eyes and imagine a beautiful looking video game, the minimalist description but robust, vibrant, colorful palette of something like RiME is what I would imagine. It still looks good, very good, in fact, but I do feel as though certain video games have an imitation beauty that feels more manufactured and deliberate. I'd say RiME is still beautiful, but not uniquely beautiful, if that makes sense. Something that assists the visuals of RiME is also the musical score, which I would describe as simplistic but very effective. It can be as little as keying in a few notes on the piano, but it still went a long way in engrossing me into the atmosphere. One of the criticisms I heard about RiME from a lot of different critics dealt with how often it felt as though they didn't understand where they were supposed to go, and that the storyline was incomprehensible. I'll touch on those both by saying that although at the very beginning, and once or twice through, I did find myself turned around and not knowing how to progress. I didn't have enough trouble personally to mention that as a criticism on my behalf. I will admit, though, the game's vagueness may have had the tendency to work against it, mostly because it doesn't instill what your primary objective is, and thereby, it's easy to lose sight of where the objective might be. As far as the storyline is concerned, I would consider the storyline as sentimental. Certain scenes I felt could have been taken out, or that they didn't really enrich like what might have been intended. Honestly, before finishing the video game, I didn't really pick up on how it was going through the stages of grief, although I could perceive an inner darkness under it all, and especially toward the end, I knew something of deep despair is what brought the story of RiME together. I could understand why some might look at the storyline as incomprehensible. I would argue it more as a minimalist, one-dimensional, and ultimately unfatal, even if it's underdeveloped or inefficiently presented. If there is something you need to know while you watch this review, it's that I have a soft spot for puzzle-solving platformers. I remember when I first discovered Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time, I absolutely fell in love with it, and I loved the genre ever since then. RiME scratches a similar itch. I was surprised with the fluidity of animation and, simply put, the amount of platforming that was featured, but I also enjoyed the puzzle solving as well. Although at times it's fair to argue the puzzles tend to repeat themselves and or don't always earn their keep. I did enjoy several puzzles, and I found the gameplay as the aspect most worth singling out. RiME does deal with a certain identity crisis, which I alluded to earlier in the review. Everything that it does feels familiar, and as though it had been trod prior. The graphics and aesthetic are beautiful, yet familiar, and like that, the puzzles and gameplay are enjoyable, but once more, don't provide a whole lot of new, worthwhile things to say for themselves. The video game can be finished in about 5 or so hours, depending on whether you decide to go for the collectibles as well. And while that is a length most would consider as short, something RiME suffers from is that on occasion it feels as though it drags. Although some of the puzzles I'd singled out as enjoyable, there are a lot of puzzles so shallow and simplified that it feels like they don't need to be there. The same can be said about certain scenes, like I said before. Also, the scenery is worth celebrating, but at times it also feels as though the long stretches of running about, simply for progression, could have been shortened. In short, what I'm getting at is, if they would have left more on the cutting room floor, RiME could have benefited as being a tighter experience altogether. Although RiME's storyline might be underdeveloped, and a lot of its ideas might feel recycled in various respects, I would still recommend it as an experience I enjoyed, and although I acknowledge and notice the flaws I mentioned, I enjoyed it a considerable amount, both as a fan of the genre and on behalf of the game's execution, which I think is worthy of merit. I wouldn't spend $29.99 on it, but if you have PlayStation Plus or can find it somewhere for cheaper than that, I think it's worthy of a playthrough. That said, I would love to know what all of you thought of RiME, whether you liked it or disliked it, loved it or hated it, and I hope you'll leave your thoughts in the comment section below. Thanks for joining me on this edition of NJ Today here on Mishmashers.com, and I'll see you next time.